Namaste. This is to welcome all of you to this very important talk. That is what I consider the very basis of our civilization. And that is why this dominates the dialogue on civilization. And we are calling this, the title of this talk is the Saraswati Civilization. Of course, there are differing perspectives, there are differing ideas, and whether it is Saraswati civilization or the Harappan civilization or the Sindhu Saraswati civilization, but all that is basically semantics. What we have is that we have an indigenous civilization, and that self pride, that self esteem that this particular civilization gave us was sought to be subverted by something called AIT or Aryan Invasion Theory. I think we've talked about it quite a lot. In fact, in the last Jaipur dialogues, it was so acute that after consulting with many people, including Nilesh ji, I announced a prize purse, which at that time I think it was a little less, but ultimately it grew to 2.1 crore. That's the prize purse right now for anyone who can scientifically prove the Aryan invasion theory. And all our esteemed viewers and our esteemed guests today would actually be surprised to note that not even a single claim has even been filed. So that is all the meat that is there in that Aryan invasion theory, which subsequently became Aryan migration theory. And as my friend Abhijit Chawla jokingly calls it, that now it has become Aryan tourism theory. So that was the counter to our Sindhu Saraswati civilization or Saraswati civilization, if you take General Bakshi's terminology. And why it is important to know about it, why it is important to know the challenges to it, and how deeply it has affected our consciousness and how deeply it has served to sow the seeds of disintegration among us, that we will discuss in today's talk. And at least I consider this to be the single most important narrative that needs to be buried, the AIT narrative, and that needs to be buried so deep that it never raises its head again. You see the effects of these things like the Dravidian movement, things like the caste narrative that is built upon these foundations. These are all built on these foundations. So let us begin with this. Let me introduce the guests that are here with us. We have Shri Raj Vedam. You know him very well, and we have had a talk recently on Jaipur Dialogues. And Nilesh Oak ji, who doesn't know him on Jaipur Dialogues? I think we've had so many sessions and so many deep topics that he is virtually a resident philosopher on Jaipur Dialogues. General Bakshi is soon going to join us. Dr. David Frawley is not able to join us, but he has very kindly sent his recorded talk. So what we'll do is, with your consent, that we will start with Dr. David Frawley's recorded talk first, and then by the time General Bakshi will also join us, and then we will go further on this. So, Dr. David Frawley, for you.
Namaste, Shri Guru Bhyo Namaha. It is my great honor to be with the Jaipur Dialogues 2020 event on Second Republic. I am happy to note I have been to all the previous Jaipur Dialogues. And I thank Sanjay Dixit for his tremendous organizing and inspirational ability to bring people together on so many important topics. It is my belief, as I have said previously, that the Jaipur Dialogues is one of the most important, if not premier, intellectual events in India, and is destined to be so for many years to come. Now, I have been asked to speak on the Saraswati civilization. And I'm speaking to you as someone who has studied Rig Veda in the original Sanskrit for 50 years, and who has written on it and translated Rig Veda and published these for over 40 years, starting with the Sri Aurobindo ashram in the late 70s and up to new books today like my Vedic Yoga, The Path of the Rishi. So Saraswati Civilization is the Vedic civilization. That is simply the case. And it's the civilization of the Saraswati River. And it is the civilization of the Saraswati culture and all the Sanskritic and all the Dharmic traditions that have arisen from that. Now, ancient India has, of course, left us many ruins and many important archaeological sites, which are still being covered and examined today. And much more is being found. Much has been found in the decades on which I have been working, and much more remains to be seen. But as we move forward, all the evidence, whether it is genetic, archaeological, literary, astronomical, cultural, and it always is showing to the existence of an indigenous vast civilization in India, mainly in the Northwest, but influencing the entire country. Very prominent in the Harappan era, but going back thousands of years before. So we must recognize India as one of the great cradles of civilization globally, a place where people also immigrated from, not just simply came into, and which spread culture, ideas, language, spirituality, agriculture, so many things in so many different directions. And so what I discovered, looking at the Vedas through my open mind and my yogic perspective, was that the Rig Veda is already the monument of a vast ancient civilization, Saraswati civilization, 10,000 hymns in very subtle and profound meters, multi-dimensional language. I call the Vedas the pyramids of the mind, which we could compare with the pyramids of Egypt, perhaps even more so. And they have also been, of course, preserved over the great period of time through not only written, but also oral traditions and special ways of chanting. So the Vedas represent our most authentic record of the ancient world in the language of the people, in the traditions and commentaries that have sustained them, our connection to the great rishis overall, and the yogis and jnanis and great dharmacharyas that have come from that. So what did I find when I looked into the Vedas? Well, first I was looking in the Vedas more into a yogic perspective, but still I saw all the other geographical and cultural factors. So Rig Veda shows a geography of 7 rivers, Sapta Sindhu, flowing to the ocean, 2 or 4 oceans, and outlines the rivers from the affluence of the Sindhu going into Afghanistan, perhaps even Central Asia, as far east as Bihar, with rivers like Saryu, and of course the oceans. And the Vedas present a maritime civilization with vast trade, with many peoples, many countries, islands and movements, ships with 100 oars, 360 oars, that's more of a metaphor. But still, this very profound literary tradition is reflecting a very vast culture. The culture mentions empires, kings, some of the Chakravartins or great emperors of India, mentioned in Brahmanas and Puranas like Sudas or Bharata, are already there in Rig Veda itself. And we have literary interpretations of the Vedas from the West that are totally inaccurate and don't even express the facts. For example, we're told that Vedas have no temples, and yet their very verses speak of temples with 1,000 pillars or even 1,000 doors by the sea. We're told they don't have cities, but they mention purs with up to 1,000 warriors, 100 of them. They mention all kinds of, let me say, kingdoms, janapadas, languages, peoples. In other words, they show a vast civilization, not only at a literary level, but they even show the implements, artifacts. They don't mention these in great detail, but they do mention, of course, the culture of the cow, the culture of agriculture, the urban culture, chariots, means of conveyance, boats, all the rest of it, and the existence of very vast areas of space, again, Sapta Sindhus, or 8 ranges of mountains. They speak of crossing the mountains, crossing the sea. And so this Vedic heritage of the global world must be reclaimed through this Saraswati civilization, a civilization of higher knowledge, but culture, art, music, all these things are there in the Vedas. Vedas give us the foundation of yoga, Vedanta, even things like Vastu, Ayurveda, Jyotish, mathematics. There's tremendous mathematics embedded into the Vedic text. And again, many, many mystic secrets, idea of a universal tradition, universal consciousness, self-realization, samadhi, higher levels of awareness extending to other lokas or beyond time, space, person, all together. All the great traditions that we find in yoga, Vedanta, Buddhism, all the different deity forms of the Hindu Dharma are there, at least in seed form, in the Rig Veda. And we can trace their origin from Rig Veda through the other Vedas, Yajur, Sama, Tharva, into Brahmanas, Aranyakas, Upanishads, and then manifesting in a vaster way, of course, in the great Mahabharata, which is sometimes regarded as the 5th Veda. But Mahabharata and Gita come at the end of the Vedic age. They show a much longer history before. So we can't place them at the beginning of the Vedic age at all, is what we can try to do. And we have, even in Rig Veda itself, hundreds of rishis, long lines of sages, a tradition that's been going on for hundreds of years, and no recognition, no statement that we came from the outside or we overcame some people. Even this famous battle of the 10 kings, or Dasharajna, in Rig Veda is a civil war. It's even an Ashwamedha. Sudas sets out his horse. So he has to prove his seniority or power with the local kings. And he struggles with all the local dynasties, including Anus and Druyus and Kirvakas, Yadus, even some Kurus. It's totally an inside story, much like the Kurukshetra war. And it shows how the whole system was connected. Now, of course, there were many other literary works probably available at the time. Much has been lost. There were other peoples, there were other deity forms used. But this whole tradition, Agni, Soma, Surya, Vayu, dharmic practices, meditation, mantra, ritual, karma yoga, is given there in great detail and explained in even greater detail through the text. The yagya is not just outer, a matter of making sacrifices or propitiating the forces of nature. The antar yaga is yoga and Vedanta for self-realization, offering prana, speech, mind to the inner flame, Chidagni, Agni of consciousness within, and honoring the rishis inside of ourselves, and the devas as representing the powers of divine light and the powers of cosmic energy overall. So we've had a continuous civilization in India going back 10,000 years with the great enlightened teachers going back perhaps almost that long, enduring to today. We must honor and recognize and hold to that. And that should be the foundation stone for understanding not only the history of India, but the history of surrounding Asia, and even perhaps the history of the entire world. Because the true history should be about our connection with the universe as a whole, not simply human beings, but our understanding of the entire realm of consciousness, which is the great teaching of the Vedas overall. So with these words, I will close my short talk, and you can now listen also to this wonderful event in all of its different forms. Hari Om Tat Sat.
Thank you, Dr. Frawley. Dr. Frawley right now is in the mountains in New Mexico where the internet connection is not working properly. That's why he had to send this recorded talk. So we have to thank him. And before moving any further, let me also make an announcement that this session is sponsored by Sri Mani and Krishna Bhagwan Kandam. We thank them very much for sponsoring this session. Now we come to General Bakshi. Welcome. And this event, rather this session, is named Saraswati Civilization. And General Bakshi is joining today this particular session, not in his usual military boots, but as the author of a very important book named Saraswati Civilization. So let's go straight to General Bakshi. So why did you name it? What we'll do is that you can have about 8 to 10 minutes, each of the three guests for the first round. Then we'll come back to you in a second round, which another 5 minutes or so. Then in the end, we'll have about 10 questions from the audience. So my question to you is that there are various names by this civilization is known. Some people call it the Harappan civilization, and the much accepted name among the scholars is the Sindhu Saraswati civilization. You chose to call it Saraswati civilization. So
Thank you indeed. It's a privilege for me to be here. And let me straight away start by answering the seminal question. Why have I called it? You know, it is supposed to be the Harappan civilization, Indus Valley civilization, Indus Saraswati civilization. But I have emphasized the Saraswati aspect because of the simple fact that 60 to 80% of the urban settlements of this civilization, the larger towns, the bigger villages, are all along the course of the dried out Saraswati, and not on the banks of the Indus. The Indus is just the outliers, frankly. If you see the population density, and I'm sorry I could not get the the slides done up in time, but I just want to show you the population density of the settlements along the Indus tract. You can see the dense clusters from the satellite imagery. 80% of the mature Harappan civilization, so-called, is all along the tract of the Saraswati. So there is that doubt, there is that basic question, which is the cradle river of the Indian civilization, right? And to my mind, the Greeks who came, they got it wrong, because when they reached India, the Saraswati by 1900 BC had completely dried out. In the north, it had been reduced to a whole series of patches of, water and lakes. South of Jaisalmer, it had gone underground. They never saw the Saraswati. They only saw the Sindhu, and they said the Indus is the cradle river of the Indian civilization. Indus, Indica, India. That's how they named us. When the Arabs came, they saw the Sindhu. They had no idea of the Saraswati, which had vanished without a trace by that time. And they said Sindhu because of that, the pronunciation part of it. It became Hindu, and Hindu to Hindustan, and Hindu to the Hindu religion. That is what the Arabs called us. They all got it wrong. The basic mother river, the cradle river of this civilization, is the Saraswati. It has been fiercely contested by the colonial historians, and it has been even more fiercely contested by their lackeys, the leftist historians who have come in tow to keep the colonial flag flying high, to see that none of the colonial narratives, the natives dare not tamper with the narratives, hand-me-down narratives of the empire. And we have been piteously continuing with the colonial era narratives of Max Muller, when we have a whole host of data in multiple fields, multidisciplinary fields. We have hosts of scientific data which was not available to Max Muller, which was not available to Mortimer Wheeler. For example, they had no damned access to satellite imagery, right? In the 1970 and 77, the Landsat satellite of the United States first beamed back images of the river, and then our own ISRO satellites, IRS-1, 2, a whole host of them have sent back imageries by the kiloton of a once dried out river, and not an insignificant river, not the Hexavarati of Afghanistan, etc., which they have been trying to palm it off as. It was a river, hold your breath, 4,600 kilometers long, 6 to 8 kilometers wide, and at Patiala, where the Yamuna used to meet this river, bring it the ice melt water, and the Satluj used to meet it just above Patiala Valley. In that area, it was 20 kilometers in width. It sustained the civilization 2 billion square kilometers in size. One of the largest civilizations of the world that dwarfed the civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia put together. The Mayas, the Incas, the Greeks, the Romans, all these empires were dwarfed in size by this so-called Indus Valley civilization, which now turns out to be the Saraswati Valley civilization. The original cradle river is the Saraswati. A study of the Saraswati civilization, helps us to address a whole host of conundrums of ancient Indian history. Aryan Invasion Theory. Fact or a myth or a canard? I would go to the extent of saying a canard, a hoax. Is that right? Aryan Invasion Theory right? Or then the subsequent, when you couldn't find enough adequate corpses of a great slaughter, great genocide by Indra, then you make it the Aryan Migration Theory, AIMA, the Indo-Aryan Migration Theory. Yeah? And when that also we haven't found sufficient evidence, now there is the alternative hypothesis of out of India theory. The simple fact is that Max Muller dated the Aryan advent to 1500 BC. And he said the Rig Veda was composed after the Aryans came to India. Now, why this obsession with trying to paint Aryans as outsiders, as exotics, as people who had come from Central Asia? Because they had to justify, British rule over totally different South Asian people. So they said, chor chor musere bhai, tum bhi chor, hum bhi chor. So what are you cribbing? What right have you? Are also invaders. What right have you to complain if we also invade and we conquer? You came and conquered, we came and conquered. So that justifies our rule. And actually that makes us kin because, we have a common Central Asian home. We have a common Aryan language, etc., 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 root mother Aryan language, and all that kind of thing, designed to justify colonial rule, rapacious loot to the natives, right? And we fell for it. We dare not change, even after they have gone. So the fact is that we have got satellite imagery, data. The fact is that we have got geological data, terrific amounts of geological data. The fact is that we have got archaeological data in bulk, right? We have got carbon dating, then we've got fluoride dating, then we have got somoluminescence dating. And Birhana has been dated back to 9,500 years from today, BP, 9,500 years from today. Mehragarh, the first settlements, have been dated to 7,500 BC, right? So the simple fact is that there is a whole lot of, then there is the genetic evidence that's now coming in largely from Harvard. But there are strong schools of contestation in India. There is the Aryan gene, which is supposed to be common, N1, A1, N1, etc. Now, the simple fact is that the oldest specimen of that so-called pure Aryan gene has been found not in Europe, not in Central Asia, but in India, 15,000 years old. What does that tell you about the strategic direction of the migration? Now, the fact that we are told is most of the migrations, most of the invasions came from Central Asia inward. So how is it that in that ancient era, there was a outward migration? Very simple. What happens if there is an ecological catastrophe? What happens if the Punjab were to be desertified? If Haryana were to become a desert? Would more people come into a place which is getting desertified, or would they go out? Simple, common sense, basic question. Geology tells you that by 1900 BC, the Saraswati had dried out to less than a trickle. It had vanished. So will more people like to come inside, crowd there, so that they can fight over little pools of water? I ask you. Is that logical? Does that make common sense? Will more people come in from where people are fleeing? So the dates are absolutely all mixed up and wrong, because geology is right or Max Muller is right. And we all know how Max Muller arrived at 1500 BC. The first paradigm was that nothing can be more ancient than the Mesopotamian civilization. That is the cradle of the Western civilization. That is the land of the Bible, and nothing precedes the Bible. That's it. You can't be older than that. Thank God that kind of a joke has now been put to rest. Okay? Because the very fact of the Indus Valley civilization, shattered that paradigm. And then they tried to deliberately put it 1500 BC, the Aryan advent, etc., etc. The fact is, the Aryan, in the Rig Veda, the Saraswati river is described as the mother of floods, the greatest of all rivers, the greatest of all mothers, the greatest of all Devis. Oh, mother, spare us. Do not flood. Do not destroy us with your flood. This is the description of the Saraswati river, right? She roars from the Himalayas. She tears, uproots the tops of the mountains like an elephant uproots a lotus flower from the pond. That is the description of the Saraswati in the Veda. And that was the state of the Saraswati 5,000 to 6,000 years from today. Period. And now we have carbon dating. If you had any doubts, upper levels of Birhana are 8,000 years old. The deeper levels are 9,500, almost touching upon 10,000 years of age of this civilization by empirical carbon dating. All right. We are not even talking of astronomical dating and stars, etc., and Jyotish, which somebody could question. We are talking of empirical scientific facts, right?
I think you have, sir.
Yeah. Have I
Yeah.
overshot my time?
Yeah, I think you've summarized it very well. And
Thank you.
we have Raj Vedam ji, who has done extensive work on all the AIT theories that are coming. We'll ask him about that. And Nilesh ji, of course, is our chronology expert, who has actually done research and found out the dates of starting from Rig Veda right down to Ramayana and Mahabharata. So I'll go to Raj Vedam ji first. Uh, General Bakshi mentioned the Aryan Invasion Theory, and we all know that I mentioned it in my opening remarks also. And Aryan Invasion Theory is the fulcrum of destruction of Indian heritage. And as I told you that in the Jaipur Dialogues, I don't know whether General Bakshi is aware of that. Last year, when we have this AIT session, Jaipur Dialogues announced a prize of rupees 2 crores to anybody who could come and prove the Aryan invasion theory scientifically, because that was a theory which was never proven. That was just taken to be the hand down from the colonial masters. That was accepted as such. Not one claim has been filed today. What is the status of the various researches that are trying to prove or disprove the Aryan invasion theory?
Okay, so namaste to our, all the viewers, and Sanjay ji, it's a real privilege to be on your channel on Jaipur Dialogues. It's an excellent question. General Bakshi ji had summarized very, very well about the Saraswati civilization. So let me start with saying that we live in strange times. We live in strange times when the textbooks we use to teach our children, for example, the NCERT textbooks, the latest revisions, if we take a look at their story on the disappearance of the civilizations, they are so loath to mention the river Saraswati by name. They do not even mention the river Saraswati by name in the NCERT textbooks. They have a vague reference to river drying up as one of the reasons for Harappa civilization dying out. So this tells me that there is a very a nexus of interest over here, which really is a continuation of frameworks that have been imposed on the historiography of India. If you look at the historiography of India, we talk about the frameworks. The frameworks are people like, for example, the colonial people. The colonial people, when they came to India, they started with a certain lens. They used a certain lens to talk about history of India, because obviously they were interested in the control of the Indian population as they conquered more and more territories. And one way to do it was to introduce the divisions and to show the superiority of their own cultures. And of course, the biases and the lenses they came with. In 1700s, they were strongly wedded to the biblical chronology, narratives, and these things impacted their way of writing history. If you go to the second framework, very soon after William Jones started talking about commonality of Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek, the Europeans started asking, who are we as a people? Are we related to the Indians? So that question led to the study of linguistics, and a whole lot of Eurocentric people started coming and saying, proposing all kinds of sound laws, saying that this is how a word might have morphed from one language to the other. And then they started with some ideas saying that, I don't think Sanskrit can be the ancestral language. Perhaps it was an ancestor to Sanskrit in addition. That from that ancestor, we have got all of these other languages, meaning the Proto-Indo-European language. And like I said, many, many sound laws formulated to try and describe how these language families came about using comparative method and linguistics and so on. And if you're talking about PIE language, now you must talk about who were these guys who spoke this hypothesized PIE language. Very well. They started a huge hunt for a homeland. Where is the homeland of the so-called PIE speakers? Initially, obviously, they said Northwest India must have been the homeland. But pretty soon they discovered that there was this Mitannis and the Hittites in northern Iraq, and they seem to have spoken a Sanskrit kind of language going to 1700 BC and so on. And so that led to some additional speculations. This is around 1880 or so. So very soon the homeland battles went from Northwest India to Germany, to Armenia, to Syria, and eventually the Caucasus, and settled down in Central Asia. So from Central Asia, the Eurocentric people said that some people went this way, that way, and those kind of things. So the first framework was colonial. Second framework was the Eurocentric people. Now, you throw into this mix the missionaries. The missionaries are a motivated lot. I mean, they want to civilize the world, right? So these people came about when the East India Company was very serious. They didn't want these guys to come and, spoil their nice loot going on. They were looting beautifully. They didn't want to rock the population. They'd already experienced the so-called rebellion at Vellore. The rebellion in Vellore was in 1800s, about 50 years before the so-called Sepoy, or the Indian First Battle of Indian Independence. So they did not want these missionaries to come. However, when the renewal of the EIC Charter came up in 1820s, 1825, the missionaries lobbied the crown really, really hard, saying, we need to come in. And eventually they started pouring in into India. And outside of the East India Company, we had Bartholomew, Ziegenbalg, Xavier, and Portuguese territories and French territories, and they were creating havoc with their things. But the real damages came when Caldwell, G.U. Pope, and these people, with a desire to convert the southern Indians, which were the early territories of the British, to Christianity. So they came about with certain narratives. And one of those narratives was, Dravidian is not the same language family as the so-called Indo-European language family. So maybe there are two races, two people here. And they started saying there's an oppression going on. These northern Indians are oppressing you southern Indians, sowing the seeds of hatred. And this hatred is what we see expressed today in the Dravidian parties that we see in southern India. It's borne great fruit, if you ask me, Caldwell's thing. So that is a third framework. Colonial first, going to Eurocentric, going on to the missionary framework. Well, after 1947, you would imagine that, wow, we are in control of our own destiny. After all, a great man said that India made a tryst with destiny in a midnight of 1947, August 15th. Well, what was the tryst and what was that vision they came with? It was a very Fabian socialism kind of a narrative that they came with, which they did not see India as the inheritor of this ancient, beautiful civilization. Rather, it was a mishmash of various ideas they came about with the idea that all of history is one of struggles, of political struggles, of struggles for people, and so on and so forth. So we inherited a massively distorted version of history, which has been inherited today by the leftist academia. These people in bed with the Marxists have come along with their narratives. And the frameworks are all bolstered by methods of linguistics, of genetics, of archaeology, of anthropology. All of these methodologies have been used over here. So I often say, whenever claims are made, we need to start with a model. If we are saying that we are logical, rational, analytical people, then we need to evaluate each claim in terms of what is the model that you're using. In that model, what are the assumptions you've built in? What is the data that you've used? Can the data be scrutinized? Can the model be scrutinized? Can the assumptions be scrutinized? Can the methodology can mean, for example, like Dr. General Bakshi said, we can use carbon dating, we can use archaeology. Now, each of these things we can scrutinize and say, are these things valid? Whatever has been said in literature and so on. Genetics comes to a certain idea. Can those methods be validated? Can those methods be studied? In astronomy, we come with certain dates. That too should be subject to criticism. We got to see, are these things valid? So eventually, when we study in the frameworks of models, methodology, data, claims, assumptions, and whatever results you get, we study these things logically and say whether something makes sense or not. Well, I started out by saying we live in strange times because by analyzing these frameworks, by analyzing their biases, by analyzing their assumptions, by analyzing their methods, by analyzing their data, we come to startling conclusions today. We see that we got a whole host of data from, for example, astronomy. astronomy going back to very ancient periods of time. And I'm sure my dear friend Nilesh will talk much more about this, going back to very, very ancient periods of time. And we go to genetics today, genetics making all kinds of claims. But if you take a look at the real impact, it says whether you look at empty DNA or whether you look at Y chromosomal works, the earliest mutations are in India. India is where the haplogroups line seems to be going out to the rest of the world. And is there really a reconvergence from Central Asia, this RNA Z93, as people are saying? That's subjective. It's subjective because there are claims made with circular arguments trying to fit in with the Aryan Invasion Theory model and so on and so forth. There is nothing in genetics that implies a direction unless mathematically you take an argument. You take an argument that the density is high there, you choose your data in your PCA analysis and show certain kind of a gradient and these kind of things and make these claims. Astute observer will ask, what is the size of your population for your studies? What is the size of, what is the methodology used? And these claims are obviously questionable. Then if you look at, like General Bakshi said, the Saraswati data, there is so much of data from Saraswati River, the hydrology, the satellite imagery, so much of it that's saying here was a living big river. And by the way, it's mentioned in the Rig Veda as a living river. But we are told that Rig Veda was composed in 1200 BCE after the so-called Aryans came to India. So we got inconsistencies like that. Look at archaeology. Archaeology is talking about, like General Bakshi said, Birana going back to 9,500 years ago, we have got settlements over there. We are finding settlements in southern India. We have found settlements in western India, in Dwarka, for example, the underwater archaeology. So clearly, whether you look at astronomy, genetics, hydrology, archaeology, or even study the scriptures that we have, whether oral tradition or committed down to writing at some point in time, everything is saying a consistent story. That consistent story is the story of civilization must be told as originating from India. And that is the story. The last point I'll make before I stop, Sanjayji, is that the gestation of knowledge systems. So very often we find claims, for example, people like Pingree, people like Newsbohr, and so many other people who say Indians were excellent students. They excellent students, but they had nothing to teach the world. All knowledge systems came from outside. Indians learned mathematics from Babylonians. Indians learned astronomy from the Greeks. Indians learned medicine from Gallen, Romans, and other such people. So we have been told these kind of things. But the reality, if you study the knowledge systems of India, we find deep knowledge going back to ancient periods of time. And in my talks, I talked about how there are several routes for knowledge transfer. We can trace knowledge going out of India in very ancient time frames, talking about the Vedic time frames, talking about the monsoon failure, 2000 BC, and the migrations to Fertile Crescent and other places, Indian knowledge going out over there. We can talk about the pre-Alexander. Even before Alexander, there was Pythagoras, Democritus, and others who came to India, took knowledge away. We can talk about post-Alexander. We can talk about the Romans, Periplus of Erythraean Sea. We can talk about the medieval period, so many travelers. We talk about the Muslim period, talk about the colonial period. In every period, Indian knowledge has seeded the world. What does that mean? Why is that relevant? Knowledge does not come just at a drop of a coin. It calls for a long gestation period with a philosophy of the land allowing for knowledge systems to flourish. And we see that in India. We see that in India. So put all of these things together, Sanjayji, and we see that there's a strong story coming out. And that story is, it is out of India, whether it is a genetic content, whether it is the intellectual content, there is a story that is coming that it is out of India. Thank you.
Quite right. Beautifully summed up, Raj Vedamji, exactly like you do. That's very, very scientifically done also. Now we come to Nilesh. Nilesh, you're muted right now. Okay. So I remember you have this four-leg theory that you have postulated, and one of those legs is chronology, of which you are quite an expert, and the other legs are whether it is an invasion or people have come from outside, or they actually brought a language, all these. So please explain how even one leg falls, this whole theory falls. And of course, do enlighten us with your chronological studies, which completely debunks this fake Aryan invasion theory and supports the Saraswati Civilization theory.
Namaskar. Thank you, Sanjay ji. And I'm in the great company of wonderful researchers and our General Bakshi ji, who has written a book. So, Pandit Vamadev Shastri ji and General Bakshi, they set up a wonderful framework for me to discuss this. Vamadev Shastri began with the cultural or civilizational aspects of Rigveda and therefore Saraswati. And General Bakshi beautifully summarized the empirical content from various different disciplines. And Dr. Raj Vedam ji went into, I like that, the structural aspect, the strategic aspects. Many times in our discussion, we may focus on a specific point, which is great. But it's important that we never forget the strategic aspect of whatever we are doing and how that is used to educate, enlighten in an entertaining fashion. Our young audience, but also our existing, the 3-4 generations of Indians, both residing inside India and outside India. So with that, what you said, the 4 legs of AIT, that's a good way to describe it. And I call this as a who, when, where, and what. So who, the so-called theory says, and General Bakshi was very euphemistic. He said, I may call it a very bad thing. This it is. Actually, I will agree with him. I call it a fraud. The whole AIT is a fraud. It's an absolutely nonsensical thing. Now, you mentioned, Sanjay ji, that maybe we should totally get rid of it. Well, we should get rid of it. It has gotten rid of it. We have to educate our people. But we should definitely keep this in a museum. Museum as an example of what kind of nonsense can be created, and it can destroy certain nations, it can destroy certain civilizations, and it can destroy especially many minds, a few generations of minds. It can deracinate from their original culture. So for that reason, it needs to be preserved. Okay, so just as a template, for people to see what kind of damage can be caused. So who in the Aryan invasion theory is naturally the Aryan. Where is that it says they came from somewhere outside India to inside India. Now, I define this in a very generic fashion because when we go to outside, there are many candidates. And that also tells you that really their focus was to make sure that it doesn't matter where they come from, but they come from somewhere outside to India. And that was very important for them. And that was the next 2 points. Especially what, which is to say, these so-called Aryans, whoever they came from, wherever they came from, outside India to inside India, they brought either the Sanskrit or precursor to Sanskrit with them. And then, as General Bakshi ji mentioned, they sat on the bank of dry river, the non-existent Saraswati, so to say, and wrote this supposedly the beautiful descriptions. And when, and these dates again go back to 2000 BC to 1500 BC. And what can be seen based on already what General Bakshi ji discussed, but also briefly what Raj Vedam ji discussed, each of the piece of empirical evidence, whether it is astronomy, whether it is archaeology, whether it is linguistics, genetics, oceanography, climatology, you just name it, physical anthropology, every single piece of data destroys, falsifies Aryan invasion theory instantaneously. And also, people wonder now, okay, so if it's not Aryan invasion theory, is it a OIT? Well, we don't have to propose OIT. I mean, we should explore this subject because that's exactly what the data is showing. But we are not talking of OIT as a response to AIT. Okay, these are not two things interconnected in some fashion. In fact, as people go looking for the explanation and why all the connections of linguistics or civilization lead back to India, the OIT is a natural outcome. Now, quickly coming to my chronology, I did not begin with the hydrology evidence, so not with the Saraswati evidence. I began with the Mahabharata text. What I did, and Raj Vedam ji talked about the framework. So just quickly mentioning the framework. My theory simply stated, all astronomy observations, there are many, many descriptions in Mahabharata, more than 300 plus. And to this day, I continue to find more. All astronomy descriptions of Mahabharata text are actual, factual, visual observations of the sky. That was my hypothesis, a conjecture. Then I started reading Mahabharata, extracted every single reference, and when I started testing this in a very most empirical, objectively scientific fashion, they all come together and point to one specific year and no other year. That year is 5561 BCE. That is more than 7,500 years ago. Then I repeated the same thing for Valmiki Ramayana. Again, same theory, only you have to replace the word Mahabharata with Ramayana. To my surprise, and I'm sure to surprise of many others, because I thought Valmiki Ramayana is much smaller than Mahabharata, but I found close to 600 astronomy references, again, when they're objectively tested in a solving jigsaw puzzle fashion. They all lead to a very specific year and no other year, 12,209 BCE as the year of Ram Ravan Yuddha. That's going back 14,000 years. And then somebody asked me to do the same to Rigveda. Now, this is when what happened is there are many astronomy references in Rigveda, but I couldn't find anything that would allow me to find the constraint, find the upper or lower limits. So that is when Saraswati came into the picture. And what a wonderful evidence that was. Rigveda is rich with Saraswati evidence. And you will see how nicely the whole history of the river Saraswati ties Rigveda. Actually, I would say pre-Rigvedic period, even when actually the words were being formed, the languages were being possibly built. But from that time onwards, from Rigveda all the way to Ramayana to Mahabharata, many people don't know that. Mahabharata has more than 100 plus, even more than 200 specific descriptions of river Saraswati. And it is in a very flux state. In some places, it is flowing beautifully. Other places, it has gone under the sand. Some other places, it is coming out of the sand. Some places is flowing underground and so on. So now if we have to connect these, say Ramayana, the Adi Kavya, Mahabharata, the Pancham Veda, okay, again, these both are Itihasa or Arsha Kavya. And with the Rigveda, the best thing is Saraswati. And the only thing I want to mention is, this is for what briefly Vamadev Shastri ji mentioned and also General Bakshi ji mentioned. Because maybe, I don't know what the reason is, but both of them, I heard the word saying 10,000 BC. And, with the whole aspect of 1500 BC for Aryan Invasion Theory, we feel good about 10,000 BC as a limit, and we should feel good about it. But the geographical data, the geology, geophysics, geochemistry, hydrology, morphodynamics of rivers, genetics, agriculture, astronomy, all that data is telling us is that, frankly, the 10,000 BC is actually scratching the surface as far as the antiquity of Indian civilization is concerned, but also the Saraswati civilization. Because there are many papers. I have like close to 200 papers that are written over last, especially like 35, 40 years. But Saraswati research even goes back to 60, 70 years, like started with Padma Shri Wakankar. But huge papers. But I'll specifically mention work of Khonde. He has published many papers, 2014, 2016, 2017. And a very interesting finding is this, and General Bakshi would be very happy to hear that, is that the Saraswati that is described in Rigveda, Giribhya a Samudrat, the river that started in high mountains and flowing all the way to the ocean, or as he beautifully described, the metaphor of elephant cutting the lotus and Saraswati cutting the mountain tops, and the mountain tops are floating on the surface of the river. Those beautiful descriptions, what Khonde paper tells us, and Khonde is not the only one. There are Singh in 2017, Dave in 2018. We have very recent papers that the grand Saraswati of Rigveda simply did not exist after 10,000 BC. That is the great conclusion of Khonde's paper. Okay, so now did Saraswati exist? Of course it existed, because there was a intensification of monsoon that happened many times. The monsoon went through up and down many times. So briefly, if I have to describe the Saraswati, the Grand Saraswati, this is now going back few years ago. So 2011, when I predicted that the Grand Saraswati has to go before 24,000 years somewhere, but I didn't have any specific evidence then. The evidence came pouring in, and what it is telling us, this is a Singh paper from IIT Kanpur 2017, that the Grand Saraswati existed from sometime 100,000 years ago to 22,000 BC. Okay, then there were a lot of changes that were taking place. One is the LGM, the last glacial maximum, maybe the water got reduced, water flow got reduced. But then there were some other factors, conflicting factors, like intensification of monsoon in like 17,000, 16,000 BP. By the time Ramayana, actually Saraswati is no longer a grand river. And I'm talking of 14,000 years ago. Saraswati still existed, but it's no longer a grand river. And you can see that descriptions from many aspects of Ramayana. In fact, the Arabian Sea in Ramayana is called Sindhu Sagar. Go figure. Okay, something very interesting. But then, so simple point I want to make it is that the Grand Saraswati of Grand Saraswati of Rigveda, we have to definitely go back before 10,000 BC. As many mentioned, the Saraswati finally completely dried out in 2000 BC. Mahabharata took place in like 7,500 years ago. And Sanjay ji, I have a simple formula, like for mnemonics. The formula, the multiplication of 7, or rather 7,000, works so beautifully. So I say Mahabharata happens more than 7,000 years ago. Ramayana happened more than 14,000 years ago. The oldest portion of Rigveda, we can decisively show with empirical evidence that they are definitely from more than 21,000 years ago. And as I work with a number of my co-researchers, chronologically speaking, we are finding very, very specific epochs. And sometimes we make simple approximations because it always may not exactly fit on the multiplication of 7. But going beyond 21,000, actually there are reference from Rigveda that takes us to 28,000 BC, that takes us to 35,000 BC, that takes us to 42,000 BC. And frankly, all the way, it does get a bit speculative as you go beyond like a 50,000 BC. But all the tributaries of Saraswati and all the distributaries of Saraswati are actually painting a beautiful chronological and also civilizational picture for our civilization.
Beautifully explained, Nilesh ji. And actually, your chronological research has completely destroyed the biblical chronology. That's what has happened. As Bakshi has said, that it was force-fitting biblical chronology into this. Bakshi, may I ask you, what is preventing our planners to finally collate all this research that is happening? And this research is happening not just in India, but the world over, and they're all reaching the one conclusion. So how can we strategize to get this into the textbooks finally?
Absolutely. You see, last year we had held a multidisciplinary seminar at the Delhi University, right? And we invited satellite imagery experts. We invited geologists of the caliber of Dr. Chaudhary of the Kurukshetra University. We invited archaeological experts to include Dr. B.B. Lal, Dr. Bisht, and a number of others. We invited linguistic experts like Dr. Kalyanaraman, many more. We invited DNA experts, top DNA experts from the microbiology labs of India. You know, they came and presented their papers. And then, of course, we invited, you know, the scriptural experts, those who had studied the Vedas, the Brahmans, the evidence in the Brahmans, the evidence, as you very rightly pointed out. You know, when the Mahabharat war was starting, Balram was very disgusted with his brothers' evil machinations. He refused to take part in the war. And he had started from Dwarka up the course of the Saraswati River on a pilgrimage to the source of the Saraswati. And en route, he found the Vinashna place where it had vanished underground. There were places where there had been drought for 12 years. And incidentally, we have the Meghalayan period of history, in which there was a 12-year-long drought which wiped out the civilizations in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the Indus Valley civilization and others. And that is why when you have such a major war, ecological catastrophes, then people get the hell out of there, out of that river basin. They'll go northwards via Afghanistan to Iran and out further. There is the scriptural evidence of the Danu river. You know, Danu is the mother of the Danavas. They were driven out in the internecine tribal warfare of the Aryans. They were driven out. Now, this so-called canard of the Dravidian, Aryan Dravidian fault line, this is the most horrible and despicable one which was imposed upon us by the colonials. They have tried to put a fault line along the Vindhyas, and it is now the basis of separatist movements which are working to try and break up India along Dalit fault line, Dravidian fault line, right? The simple fact is that in the Vedas, the war is between Aryan tribes. There is no question of a war north and south of the Vindhyas. The Aryan tribes are dasas. Who are the dasas? In Iran, the S word becomes H. Soma becomes Homa. Sindhu becomes Hindu. They are dahas. The Iranian peasants are still called dahas. The major fight has taken place between the Suras and Asuras. Ahura Mazda, right? The Zend-Avesta. The polarity is exact opposite. The Devas are the villains there, whereas the Asuras are the good people. Ahura, Asura, Mazda, Ahura Mazda, right? The real war was between this, and the Vedas speak of two wars, not just the war of the 10 kings, which is between Sudas and the Dahas from Iran, who come and fight and join the battles here. They were initially in India. They were pushed out. They were pushed out of the Arijikia region because of the first war, which is that war, War of the 20 Kings. The War of the 20 Kings is between Devodasa and Shambhara. He destroys 100 fort cities of Shambhara. The war is for the control of the Soma producing region. So much for this nonsense of the Dravidians. Now, you see, what we have done is we did this multidisciplinary seminar, then I came out with this book. I have been trying to go to the powers that be. I have met 3 HRD ministers so far and culture ministers, and I have been trying to request them to establish a Saraswati Research Institute which is multidisciplinary. It will need many disciplines. You will need the radioisotope scientist for carbon dating. You will need the archaeologist. You will need the geologist. You will need the paleo channel experts as to how the channels of the Saraswati have changed, how the Yamuna used to join the Saraswati, the Satluj used to join the Saraswati, how when they sort of, tectonic plate activity caused them to drift away. Yamuna captured by Ganga, Saraswati captured by the Indus. This becomes a monsoonal stream. It thrives for some time, then the monsoon fades and it dies out completely. So we have to now own up our history, for God's sake. French history is not written by Harvard. Russian history is not written by Oxford. Chinese history is not written by anybody but the Chinese. But this is very strange that authoritatively Indian history cannot be written by the Kalus. It is beyond our ken to be objective, to be scientific, to be empirical. It has to come from either Wendy Doniger or the Harvard gang, which is there, and they will dictate to you what your history is. They are spin doctoring facts because they don't like the idea that all Aryans came from India, and India which they had enslaved. They don't like that idea. So, there is so much of Tony Joseph's book, if you see, on the DNA mapping of India. What a disgrace. The way you are trying to force fit facts. You have a very narrow database. Most of it is from the BMC region and from the Swat region of Afghanistan, Pakistan. You've not taken the entire data of North India. And then, it is like looking for you lost your watch. So I will go look for it only where there are street lamps. Jahan there are saab, main dekhne hi nahi jaun. You see, it is very difficult to preserve DNA in India. There is very little DNA which is extant of that olden time, right? Very little. And that does not mean that there were no humans in India. No, so don't give us that crap. They were saying that there were no chariots in India. Bagpat, please go there and see a chariot which is, of the time of the Indus Valley civilization, the Mahabharatan era. Chariot has been discovered. Wood doesn't last long in India, Baba. It decays, it decomposes. So it's not like the desert. So the desert is not, civilization is not older because the climate better preserves the remains. The simple thing is we have to find the gumption to come to terms with our history, to own up to our history, and to have a proper, get the best mind. And the best mind doesn't mean my closest relation, by the way. My best mind is not my closest relation, my buddy that आप ये institute संभाल लीजिए. Give it to the best minds in the country. Get people, Indians who are outside, who are acknowledged in their fields. Set up a Saraswati Institute that will go into allied problems of Aryan Invasion Theory, out of India theory, whether the Saraswati civilization and the Vedic civilization is one and the same, whether the Indus Valley so-called Harappan civilization, they are coterminous geographically. Are they also co-located in terms of time, space-time? And the best part is, sir, that when you study the Saraswati Valley civilization, we haven't deciphered the language, but we have got a whole lot of terracotta dolls and figurines and seals, which, create a proto-language of sorts, which is visual, right? So there are little dolls of girls, of women, with bangles up to their arms, like they still wear in Saurashtra, right? Bangles up to their arms, they still wear them. They have got bindis in the center of the forehead, sir. They have got vermilion in the central median parting of their hair, sir, on these statuettes. We have got statuettes in the poses of yoga, asana. You got statuettes in the poses of yoga. You got statuettes of people doing dhyana. You got that proto-king, who is in meditation. Somebody saying he is half asleep, he is doping. But he is half-closed eyes, he is in meditation. You got Shivalingas, n number of Shivalingas. Go to the National Museum and you will see the Shivalingas that have come from there, right? You have got people leaves. You see the design of the boats, they are still the same in Maharashtra, that which is there on your seal. Same design of the boat. The proportions of the toy bullock carts are exactly the same as this. They've got chariot, right? Therefore, there is a lot that is common. This Namaste. There are a statue in the Namaskar Mudra, in this Mudra, which the Buddhist monks do in Thailand, in Indonesia and Bali, Japan, everybody, this Namaste, Anjali Mudra as it is called, right? It is there in the so-called Indus Saraswati Valley civilization. That means what it points out to is an amazing degree of cultural continuity. Is the Egyptian civilization today the same as it was in the times of the pyramids? My foot, they have no resemblance whatsoever. Islam has destroyed the vestiges of that ancient civilization. Same for Sumeria, same for Babylon, same for Greece, same for Rome. Is it the same today? No, sir. Which is the civilization which has got an amazing degree of continuity in space and time? At least, as he very rightly said, I'm sure it goes older, but at least 10,000 years, because we've got carbon dating evidence for it. We've got very empirical carbon dating evidence for it. And therefore, we need to now take it up on a war footing. 6 years we have had of the NDA regime. And if we still have not been able to change our history book, sir, we have no one to blame but ourselves. You can't blame the Congress for that any longer. We have been in power for 6 years. But you know the problem? The problem is the Babus. The Babus are the upholders of the secular history they learned from Macaulay and Max Muller and Mortimer Wheeler. And they'll be damned if they let a bunch of what they feel is RSS guys run amok with your history. It's not so, sir. Please get the top scholars. Please get a multidisciplinary team of the top scholars and study and rewrite your history empirically. You can't do that. You still have to depend on foreigners. It's a disgrace. It is nothing short of a disgrace. I'm again going to meet, this is the third HR minister that I will be going to. Everybody tells me, yes, sir, yes, General Saab, bilkul theek. We will do it, and they do nothing. We still have Bhagat Singh as terrorist in our history book. The Gurus, the Sikhs are terrorists and looters and marauders. You know, there is a limit to how much you can, force fit facts to suit a particular stupid ideology. They wanted to start Indian history. With due apologies, I am not into the communal angle, but the Congress went out of the way to enforce a particular paradigm onto us. History starts with Babur. उसके पहले तो हिस्ट्री ही नहीं है साहब भारतवर्ष की, इतिहास ही नहीं है. मतलब I mean, you must be sick in the bloody head. Sick in the head. And there is that magisterial queen, what's her name? Thapar, Robilla Thapar and Irfan Habib. So we said, please come to us in Vivekanand International Foundation. I was their deputy director. We said, we'll get our scholars. Please come, let's discuss. They refused to come. Refused to come. It is beneath our dignity to talk to right-wing people. That way, that doesn't wash, huh? Because it just shows that you lack empirical evidence. You are trying to impose a historiography onto us. You're trying to twist facts. You're trying to follow a colonial narrative. The pity is the empire has shifted to the other side of the Atlantic. And it's far more dangerous that way as far as cultural control, cultural manipulation is concerned. You know, Sidney Sheldon Pollock and Wendy Doniger are doing it in a no-holds-barred fashion. There are think tanks in America, there are think tanks in Europe, which has got maps of India, which shows the top area from Pakistan to Bangladesh as Mughalistan. The lower area below that is pink, it is Dalitistan, your Chhattisgarh area, Dalitistan. And then the area down south of the Vindhya is Dravidistan, because they created those fault lines. And they are now trying to see that you don't become too big for your shoes, you don't become too strong. So therefore people will try and control your history, control your narrative, write them for you. And we like suckers, if we want to go along, I'm very sorry, sir, you have nobody to blame but yourself.
Right, sir. That is well expressed. So we need to get hold of our own narrative. We're already about an hour and quarter into it. And so I think Raj Vedam, I'll ask one more question each to Raj Vedam ji and Nilesh ji, and then we take the question and answers. Raj Vedam ji, what is the latest in DNA research right now, both on the mtDNA side and on the Y chromosome side?
So work goes on. Work goes on. I think that is the bottom line, and a lot of papers do keep coming from time to time. However, I'd like to highlight this the work from Harvard Medical School that talks about genome-wide research. Let's recollect that. Initially, research started with mtDNA, which is a maternal mitochondrial chromosomes, and looking at the mutations therein, and that established long timelines for mtDNA. And that it couldn't answer some of the smaller migrations that might have happened in smaller time frames, like, for example, the so-called Aryan Invasion Theory. For that, people said, let's look at the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome apparently gave a little more resolution, though, like I said, some of the most ancient Y chromosome mutations, the F, for example, F line, was in India. It's from India that all the remaining lines came, the G, H, I, J, K, all these mutation lines came from India. So after having found that, they said even these timelines are too ancient, so we need finer resolution so that we can talk about these newer timelines. So they said, all right, let's take a look at the R1A. R1A, Peter Underhill, 2014 work, he said that R1A probably appeared in the mutation record around 20,000, 25,000 years ago. It appeared in the mutation record. That too cannot answer much of these questions. So they looked at finer resolution of R1A and homed in into R1A Z93, which apparently entered in the mutation record around 6,000 years ago. And so using that, they started trying to say, where could this mutation have originated, given that there is a huge presence of R1A in Uttar Pradesh, in some other parts of Northwest India, some parts of Central Asia, and so on. So that led to a lot of speculative research. And between 2010 to maybe up to 2010, I'd say, people speculated that I'm using the word speculation a little loosely. They started saying that it could have been in Central Asia. It could have, some people said it was in South Asia. Some people said it was in Northwest India. Some people said various places. So if you take 10 researchers, maybe 7 or 8 of them suggested R1AZ93 could have appeared in the Indian subcontinent and gone out of that. Whereas 4 to 5 people would have said, no, it probably appeared in Central Asia. So the reasons for the differences, again, have to go by critiquing their methodology, their papers, their data, and what kind of assumptions they built into those studies. We'll understand why they came with these frameworks. Anyway, around that time frame, maybe 2010, 2011, David Reich of Harvard Medical School, his group started talking about genome-wide research. Said, okay, we looked at the mtDNA, did not come to resolution, looked at Y chromosome, did not come to resolution. We have 22 autosomes. So why don't we look at the remaining chromosomes and see if there are any patterns we can figure out, any kind of mutations and patterns over there. So therein was born the idea that if we get an ancient sample, and from that ancient sample, if we can recover the genome-wide information, then we can compare that with the present-day populations and try to say, how is that old sample related to present-day populations? So this is the objective of that admixture studies and other things which they did. And by the way, it is not as simple as going to an ancient skeleton, taking a dental record or the middle ear or other things, because the data is greatly contaminated. It's contaminated by bacteria because the specimen has been lying in the soil for 4,000, 5,000 years in the case of Harappa. So when you're in the soil for so long, bacterial DNA contaminates the actual DNA, in addition to mineralization of the soil, because soil, when you're underwater and the salty water, that too can destroy the DNA profile. So they get bits and pieces of the DNA. It's not as if they can recover the entire DNA, but bits and pieces from here and there, and they fill in the blanks using maybe chimpanzee DNA, maybe human DNA. So all these things are used to fill in the blanks using lab methods and sequencing and all these kind of things. And they claim that, okay, I have an ancient sample now. And from that ancient sample, I'm going to talk about these things. So let us now cut to the year 2018. In around 2018, there was a publication from Harvard Medical School that came out with a bold claim. And that claim was that around 7,000 BCE, there were these Iranian pastoral farmers who came into India, and they spread pervasively in India, northern Indian population and the southern Indian population. And they were the bedrock, if you will, of the Indian population. And then around 4,200 years ago or so, there's a so-called Aryan Invasion Theory. They said that these guys from Central Asia also came into India, and they mixed with the northern population, and they formed this block called ANI, Ancestral North Indian. And this Ancestral South Indian, which has got a component of the Andamanese people, this is a separate block, and that's another separate block, and this is the division. This is how these people mixed. So there was a 2015 paper first by Priya Murjani and others that talked about ANI, ASI. And later, 2018, Vagish Narsimhan and others that talked about this in a preprint that talked about this Iranian pastoral farmers coming into India. Then that was pretty soon there was a paper from Netherlands, I forget the Damgaard, I believe. So they came and said, no, there is no Yamnaya genes to talk about over here. In fact, it's the Botai people who are different from the Yamnaya people. So they disputed the earlier finding. And I said, if you have two groups of researchers, one in Harvard, one in the Netherlands, and they're talking two different things, what does it mean? Red flags must go up. The red flag goes up saying, is your model wrong, data wrong, methodology wrong, what is wrong? So I also said in my talks around the time frame that, look, if you take a look at the Indian records, and why would I discount the Indian records? The Indian records are talking about the Anu and the Drihyu and the battles that they had and migrations out of India going outside. Where is the signature of that out of India in your DNA studies? If you don't show me that signature, I told for myself that's a red flag. Second, we know that there was a monsoon failure in India, over India, around 2000 BC, 200-year monsoon failure. In that 200-year monsoon failure, we have got a lot of evidence of out-of-India migration. For example, cattle genomics and other things, and the lactase persistence issue. These things tell us there's an out-of-India around this time frame. But that too does not figure in your 2018 paper and claims. So I said, we have got some serious problems over here. As of on cue in 2019, they came out with a paper in Science, the same group from Harvard Medical School, saying that they have taken back that earlier claim that Iranian pastoralists came to India in 7000 BCE, and they said that is no longer valid, but they still held on to their earlier idea that there was an Aryan invasion around 2000 BCE into India. So they held on to that. At the same time, their co-collaborators in a second Cell paper were Vasant Shinde, Neeraj Rai, and several other people who had worked in the genomics in Harappa. So they were working desperately on the Harappa samples and trying to get a workable record out of that. And common reading that I've done on newspapers tells me they faced great difficulty in getting the full genomic record. Eventually, they managed to get a sample and they tried to figure out the genomics. What exactly is Harappa sample all about? Well, it turned out that in their research, they said this. They called it the Indus Valley Cline, which is basically a mutation lineage. And they said this Indus Valley Cline has got a common link with the Ethiopian hunter-gatherer going back almost 40 to 50,000 years. In other words, the Indus Valley Cline in India and the Ethiopian hunter-gatherers have a common ancestor so old, meaning that these are all people endemic to India. For at least 50,000 years, the Indus Valley people who gave rise to the rest of the Indians are from India. That was their conclusion. So they said there does not appear to be Iranian pastoral content into India as claimed 7000 BCE. Rather, from later mutations out of the India line, they said there's another mutation line that seems to go with the Iranian hunter-gatherers who have got not so much content of Anatolia. As you go further and further down the timeline, the Iranians have got more and more of Anatolian content. As expected, if you take, for example, Colin Renfrew's theories of agriculture from Turkey, Anatolia spreading in these parts, along with these things. So the whole field is filled with claims and counterclaims and assumptions made. As of today, this is the understanding about genome-wide research, that there is no Iranian pastoral content, but the claim of Aryan invasion still holds. It is not discounted by Neeraj Rai and Vasant Shinde's paper. That paper still allows room for this claim by Harvard Medical School that in 2000 BCE, the Central Asians came into India. So this claim still holds. However, like I said, if you study the methodology, earlier they made a claim in 2018 or so. At that time, I questioned in my talk saying, what is the sensitivity of your study? What will happen if you take a few data points and throw it out and add some other data points into your study? Will you converge to the same answer, or will you converge to a different answer? If you converge to a different answer, it tells me that your result was highly dependent on a few data points, which we removed. And that is not okay. We need a robust results. We shouldn't have results that are strongly dependent on a particular sample that you included. That is the problem. If such is the case, then you cannot make these global claims saying that I have discovered what the Indian genomic record is. You cannot do that. You can only say that I have a narrow claim coming out of these narrow data points I've taken. And guess what? In this 2019 paper, the difference is they found some graves in Iran, Gonur, or some such place like that, where they found 11 skeletons, ancient skeletons, that they said were in cultural contact with Indus Valley. I don't even know what that means, by the way, cultural contact Indus Valley. But anyway, they took these additional 11 skeletons samples and put it into their study. The minute they put this, it converts to a different answer. And that answer does not show Iranian content over here. So this validates what I was saying earlier, that, wait a minute, all your studies are based on certain assumptions. They're based on assumptions. They're made on, for example, the circularity assumptions. But the problem is like this. Supposing a mathematical procedure admits multiple answers. How do we choose one answer? Why would we privilege that? And the mental picture you can have, metaphor is, supposing you're in New Delhi, let us say you're in Hyatt Regency in New Delhi, and you want to go to the T3 terminal. So you open up your Google map and say, how do I go from my hotel to the T3 terminal? Google map will say you can go by this route, you can go by this route, you can avoid highways and go like this. This will take 45 minutes, this will take 1 hour, this will take so much time. Now, just because I chose one of those routes does not make it any more correct than the other routes. They too will lead to that population. Now, by the way, the mathematical procedure will say, because I went on this route, I saw 5 gas stations, I saw 5 hotels, I saw 10 apartment complexes, and therefore I'll make a story based on these things. If you had gone on the other route, you'd have found 15 gas stations and 30 apartment complexes. What does that tell you about your story? So this is the nature of the circularity of the argument. In order to constrain the mathematical results, because it's giving too many answers, they add the linguistic constraints. Linguistic constraints are talking about this PIE model and out of Central Asia. And that time frame, they say so many generations could be there, maybe 100 generations, 200 generations, 300 generations. These things are put as upper bound and lower bound in the mathematical studies. And your iterative algorithms are made to converge depending on these constraints that you choose. And just because it converges, you say, aha, I got a nice fitting with the linguistic model, and I done it. Wait a minute, that's a circular argument. You started that assumption, and you converged to that assumption. What does that tell? Just because you got that. I would say, if you had got a different constraint fitting, let's say, the out-of-India model, would you have a better convergence and better loss function? Would you have that? Nobody's reported such a study, but I'll be glad to see things like that. So my bottom line is, all those studies are coming and claims are being made. None of these papers reveal these things. Even the simple idea of mathematical model. Let me just give one example, Sanjayji, and I'll stop over there. The one example of mathematical model. David Reich, in his book, How We Got Here, he says the Europeans are more closely related to the Indians than to the Chinese. And he says Chinese are more closely related to Indians than to the Europeans. So you might think, in his mathematical model now, he's going to put India over here, Europeans over here, and Chinese over here, and converge his models. But he didn't do that. He put a layer of abstraction in between. He put a layer saying this is the Proto-Indo-European speakers from whom the Europeans and Chinese have come. So right there is a circular argument. Right there, the model that you use, that can be critiqued. Is that model right? So that's a question. So just like we do with anything in our daily lives, we base our actions and decisions on models. Even if anything that we do, whether it's a bank account, whether you're going into a battle, or whether you're doing an engineering study, you have a model. You do a model, you do a simulation exercise, you figure out what's going on, you figure out the weaknesses, and you take a decision. So the claims in these papers, I am saying, are not sufficiently peer-reviewed. They need to be critiqued on sensitivity, on the data, on the model, on the assumptions, and then people need to call out what would happen if you remove the circular argument out. You started with an argument. You started with these constraints, upper bound, lower bound. What will happen if you remove that? You started with this additional layer of abstraction. If you remove that, what happens? These are vital questions to answer. So that's my conclusion, Sanjay ji, that there is a lot of problems with studies.
That was very scientifically explained. Excellent. Nilesh ji, you have the last word, and after that we go to question. We already, in fact, almost half an hour over our time. You're muted.
Oops. All right. Do you have a specific question, or just give me a last?
Yeah,
I mean, just you want me to give a last word? Okay. So I'll keep it short since we are already above time. If we have to summarize, say, last 35 years of Saraswati research, this is what it tells us. It definitely destroys Aryan invasion theory. But for our own side, like introspection, it also helps us get rid of some of the age-old notions or dogmatic notions that we might have hanging around, So I'll mention some. For example, last 35 years of Saraswati research, this is what it tells us. And when I say 35, just to give you the bounds, I'll say starting with Mary Corty, 1986, a French scientist, all the way to 2020, our year, like someone like James Blinkhorn, his recent paper on how old Saraswati is. What it tells us is that Saraswati started very long time ago, and I'll mention James Blinkhorn's conclusion at the end. But what we know is that around 50,000 years ago, so between 50,000 BC and 40,000 BC, Yamuna separated from Saraswati and started going towards Ganga. Now, why is this important? Because that gives us a upper limit on the timing of Ramayana. Ramayana cannot happen anytime before 50,000 BC. That's very important, especially when on our side, now this is not British or other people telling us it happened long time ago, but we are stuck into millions and multi-millions of years. So this is very important evidence for that. Then comes LGM. It tells us that the Grand Saraswati of Rigveda sometime definitely stopped around 22,000 BC. That's another landmark evidence that we have. The third piece is very relevant for Ramayana again, is that this is Singh paper, IIT Kanpur 2017, that Satluj separated from Saraswati, turned sharp westward and started meeting the Punjab rivers. And that happened around 13,000 BC. And why is this important? Because Ramayana has a description of Satluj flowing in the sharp west direction. So therefore, it can only happen after 13,000 BC and so on. And I'll conclude with the very recent, hot from the press paper from James Blinkhorn. This is 2020, and I think it's in a quaternary reviews, where, and for some of my research, going back to 2011, 2014, and some of my co-researchers, we working together, we had predicted, or because we demanded, let's say, that doesn't mean the empirical data will give us that. But we thought not only the Saraswati can go back to 90,000 BC or 100,000 years, but actually it needs to go it could exist even before, based on some of the Rigveda data and some Purana data that we were looking at with various multidisciplinary evidence. And lo and behold, I didn't think at least that I will ever get any data going beyond 100K. But this is a 2020 paper, just a couple of months ago or something like this quaternary reviews. And where it's right close to your place, Sanjayji, near Bikaner, and at that quarry, where the evidence that they have found is that it's telling us a reference to Himalayan river going back to, now watch this number, 172,000 years ago. 172,000 years ago. Now, to many others, they will say, what are you talking? Just do the testing again. And I would encourage, as Vedamji said, we should scrutinize every single data point. But when I heard that number, I did not even flinch. I had no reason to. In fact, I have this big figure that Mrs. Rupa Bhattiji drew for our group. And that actually takes us back to 220,000 years. We are talking of some evidence going back to 220,000 years for Saraswati. This is a prediction. This is a speculation, you can say. And now this James Blinkhorn evidence actually takes us to 172,000 years.
Thank you, Nilesh. Now let's handle some questions. We have about 9 or 10 questions. But
press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.
Okay, so I would request the answers to be kept brief so that we may be able to finish in the next 15 minutes or so. Lal Singh, Nilesh ji, I am awaiting for your book, which establishes how old is Hindu civilization, approximate timeline. When is it coming? Your three books are eye-opening for me, and I keep 2 or 3 spare copies always for gifts.
Okay, I'll give a brief answer, Sanjay ji. They are coming very soon. But let's not get into semantics of Hindu religion. We talked about Saraswati civilization. Frankly, the way I say it, if you call it Indian civilization, Hindu civilization, Bharatiya civilization, Saraswati civilization, I am okay with any of these names as long as we are clear as to what we are trying to say. So I am not stuck in semantics, and I don't want our viewers and readers to be stuck in semantics.
Right. Next one, Ajay Sharma. Why cannot we establish a university for education board that ensures our Indic knowledge, including about the Saraswati civilization, is taught to our future generations, which also translates our ancient texts? General Bakshi? I think you're muted.
Research Institute. Oh, sorry.
You're good. Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, you will not. It's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah. All right. I certainly go along with this suggestion. There is a need for a Saraswati Research Institute, which will look into the umbrella, period of our ancient Indian history. And in fact, you need another research institute for your recent history too, like we found with when it came to Nehru and Gandhi and Subhash Chandra Bose. So the very ancient and the very recent have been prone to a great amount of deliberate distortion, misrepresentation of fact, and circularity, as was very rightly pointed out, and trying to force fit narratives and tell us that what Max Muller said is damned gospel truth. And how dare you black-skinned people question? I will not take that nonsense anymore. So we need to launch a specific concerted program where we waited so long, we'll wait another 2, 3, 4 years. Get the best minds, get the best Indians. Get them from abroad, get them here, because then at least they have a kind of a fidelity to this thing. It's not that they will be subjective. An Indian scholar can be as objective as anybody else. But we need to go about it systematically. We can't make one particular discipline the touchstone. It has to be a multidisciplinary approach. You must involve, the satellite imagery experts, the geologists, the paleo channel experts, the hydrographic experts. You must get the archaeologists. You must get the carbon dating people. You must get the linguist scholars. You must get the scriptural scholars and the astronomers who will come on to from the astrology side, the configuration of the stars, as was being very well brought out. May I just add one thing in passing? To the very brilliant analysis on DNA and where it is stood, I must thank Vedji. But all that I would say, the circularity stinks. The circularity in this that they first started with that all agriculture came to India from outside. We were so dumb that we did not learn how to make, grow our own plants and foods and domesticate animals. It all had to come to us from the Mesopotamian cradle. From there it came to Iran, and from there it came here. Autonomous development. There is n number of evidence which has now come in that in Mehragarh in 7000 BC, we had started domesticating plants. We had started cultivating, barley and the other kind of thing. There is evidence in the Ganga Valley of rice going back to 7,000-8,000 years, right? So this whole the Iranian agriculture export, intellectual property Iranians की है, Mesopotamians की है, हम चोर हैं, हमने सब copy किया. I don't buy that stupid argument, and that's why they had to shelve. Rhine and Gang had to shelve what they were doing about the Iranian part. But they're stuck with dogmatic this thing to the Aryan invasion part. Now, may I just point out, they also say, and please correct me if I'm wrong, they also say that it was a male-dominated Aryan invasion. They left their wives and children.
I know.
No, that's a fact. That is what Rhyme is saying. They left their wife and children behind. They came alone, a Shara bachelor group, and they did not fight any war. They did not defeat the local people. But somehow thereafter, they had a massive imprint on the gene pool. The impression they left on the genetics is so out of proportion to the numbers that came, that it is like, every single Indian female left her partner and went to sleep with these foreigners. It doesn't gel, because we've had invasions later when there was rampant, rape and loot and murder. That has not left a genetic imprint, by the way. Just by the way. You take the invasion of Alexander, was pretty brutal. Then Muhammad Ghori, Ghazni, then Nadir Shah, and all these people who have come in subsequently. How much of an impress have they left on our gene pool? So this brilliant set of Aryans who came 2000 BC, 1500 BC, when the Saraswati had dried out, desertification had taken place in Rajasthan. Rajasthan was as green as Assam. I hope you know that. Rhinoceros and tigers were there. That's what the seals show you. And that's what the remains tell you. So all this, there is a very calculated attempt from Harvard, I'm very sorry to say, to force fit facts and to say what the colonial said was right and you are wrong. That Abrahamic certainty that I am right, you are wrong. Mine is the only way, the rest is the highway. I'm sorry, it doesn't work that.
So, in a sense, you completely favor this idea that is there in this question. So, let's take the next one. Raj Vedam, this is, give this to you. What is the truth behind the Triveni Sangam, a confluence of Saraswati, Yamuna, and Ganga in Prayagraj?
So very interesting. So like I often say, anytime we find a data point or a claim in the ancient epics or literature, that must be taken seriously. Can we find evidence for that? Now, I don't have much of an opinion over here because I don't know what data is over there on this one. However, a researcher needs to go look at the satellite imagery and say if satellite imagery can uncover these ancient river paths and see if there is a crossing in these kind of places and uncover the facts. So that is the best take that I can give on this one, Sanjayji. But on the earlier question, I do have a point to make. On the earlier question of the narrative, so if we can admit the colonial, the missionary, the Marxist, the Eurocentric, and the leftist narrative, my question often is, why is there not a place for the emic narrator? Why is there not a place at the table for the insider, the practitioner of the tradition? That person also needs a place at the table to discuss these things. So the policymakers need to sit and ask if we can admit colonial, Eurocentric, and Marxist, missionary, and the leftist. Wait a minute, there are a whole bunch of practitioners in this country. What do we do with them? do their opinions not matter? Somebody needs to think about that we have got so many Sanskrit scholars in the country, so many professors, so many practitioners of Hinduism in the country. They have a story to say. And does their story not matter? Are they not part of the civilization? That realization needs to sink into the policymakers. And the best way to figure out who are the people who are thwarting this is to open your NCERT textbook. Please open your NCERT textbook that has got a committee members. Who are the people who wrote that textbook and so on? Those are the people standing between you and the narrative that needs to come in. Those are the people that need to be highlighted in media, and we need to talk about their credentials to do these kind of things. So that's my quick take on the two
next
issues.
Shabarinath, if Saraswati was draining into the Arabian Sea, then what about Triveni Sangam in Allahabad? It's belief versus science. No, this question was just addressed by Shri Raj Vedam, so I'm going to pass it. Unless Nilesh ji, you have something to add.
If I can briefly add, which is again those two questions together, we can think of this addressing it, and everyone has to do it at least to begin with in a subjective mind. We can do this through Shraddha and Buddhi. So just purely on the Shraddha, that person doesn't need any empirical evidence. If somebody wants to believe the three rivers, including Saraswati at Prayagraj, and if that makes that person very happy in a subjective mind, I'm okay with it. as long as that person doesn't push this therefore to be included into a textbook or as an empirical research, because it is not. If you apply the buddhi, what we can see that this is not unique to the Saraswati in Prayagraj. If you go to Dwarka, after the Dwarka is destroyed, many people are trying to find their place of reverence, just like Saraswati was a place for reverence. So same thing with the Dwarka. And therefore, we have come up with many Mula Dwarka. Right in Gujarat, you can find 3-4 different Mula Dwarka. After disappearance of Saraswati, you find many small and big rivers named as Saraswati in the memory of that old Saraswati. So if you understand with the buddhi, you can do that. And if you can combine Shraddha and buddhi, that's great.
Okay, very good answer. Okay, next one. Lal Singh Ishkanshi. Nilesh ji explains Surya Siddhanta, oldest update, which he was able to establish. Approximation will do.
Okay, so one-liner is easy to do. The oldest Surya Siddhanta update that I have figured out, this is in my first book, in the Mahabharata book, When Did the Mahabharata War Happen? That takes us back to 14,500 BCE, which is approximately 17,000 years ago.
Okay, Pradeep Kumar. General Bakshi, please provide the links to the facts acceptable in the West that will prove the existence of supreme civilization thousands of years before CE. I think this requires a whole research paper to be handed over to you. And I think he's in great detail dealt with most of it. But if briefly you could address.
So I'll briefly summarize. Like I said, first is that the contestation was कि Saraswati river ही नहीं था साहब. There is no river called the Saraswati. There is the Hexaravati in Afghanistan, and Romila Thapar wants to tell us ये वो है. There is a Ghaggad Hakra alignment, which is useless. No great river. So the basic denial point is there was no Saraswati river. I think that nonsense has been well taken care of by the evidence of satellite images. Conclusively, Paleo Channel experts have identified the courses of the Saraswati, the Y1, Y2, Y3 courses of the Yamuna, which used to first join the Saraswati, and then when there was a tectonic plate activity, there was shear fault in the Shivaliks, then she changed course and she was captured by the Ganga. Similarly, it happens with Satluj. It used to be joining the Saraswati, tectonic plate activity 2,700 years ago. It goes and joins the, there are many dates now, but it goes and joins the Indus. It becomes a monsoonal stream, and monsoons fail, it dies out. So the river is established. Archaeological work, tremendous archaeological work has been done on the Saraswati, Sindhu Saraswati civilization, which very conclusively proves to you that there was a, initial Harappa phase, a mature Harappa phase, and then a terminal dying Harappa phase. All that has been recorded, and how the settlement started shifting northward. You've got the pottery of that places, the terracotta, idols and this thing, the pots and pans, which I would still love to have in my house. I mean, there is ample archaeological evidence to substantiate a great civilization 5,000 years from today in a flourishing manner, and it was there from about 10,000 years from today. 10,000 years from today. And what is most remarkable is the expanse in space and time. 2 billion square kilometers of area, standardization of weights, measures, brick sizes in that 2 billion square kilometer area, measurements, etc., house design, boat design, bullock cart design. There is a great standardization across this civilizational area, right? And then there is the continuity. From that day till this, the women are still putting bindi, we are still doing the Anjali Mudra of Namaste, we are still doing yoga, we are still doing dhi or meditation, right? In terms of cultural continuity, no civilization, including the Chinese, can hold a candle to the Indian civilization in sheer cultural persistence and continuity. So if you want to look for your grand narrative, we are the oldest surviving civilization which has come down more or less extant. Sanatan means immortal. Sanatan Dharma. You know, it has been continuing in that same, the courtyard in the center with the tulsi plant and rooms around. That is the design of the houses in Harappa. That is the design of the houses in Dholavira and in Rakigiri and other places. So the sheer continuity. What characterizes the Indian civilization? Yoga, dhyan, dhi mahi, dhiyo yo na prachodaya. Dhi is meditation, and yoga, the postures of yoga, those are the constants that come to us from at least 5,000 years till now. And I'm sure if we dig deeper, we'll find even older evidence of a 10,000 years of continuity. कुछ है हम में कि मिट सकती नहीं कभी हस्ती हमारी सदैव रहा है दुश्मन दौरे ज़मां हमारा. You see, that is your grand narrative. Actually, that is what emerges. You are the oldest, continuing, flourishing civilization, living civilization, not dead, not ossified, living. For God's sake, respect your heritage. Learn to respect your past. That continually induced sense of congenital inferiority has now got to go. 74 years is a long bloody time. We don't have to hang on to it. Look at our people. They're doing so well in information technology, in NASA. 30% of NASA is Indian. Most of the IT giants are Indian. So the Indian brain is up there. And therefore, we need to apply that to our history and not leave it to clowns. I'm very sorry to state, we cannot leave it to clowns and relations and friends and associates welfare. We need people of quality. When you get that team like that, you assemble and you rewrite your history, you will be doing your civilization the greatest favor.
Thank you, sir. That brings us to the end of today's show, and I am highly obliged to this esteemed panel. I also have to thank you, the sponsors for this session, Srimani and Krishna Bhagavan Gandham. And we also inform everybody that sessions are open for sponsorship. We have got 5 sessions sponsored already. Many more can be sponsored if you so want. Thank you, General Bakshi. It was greatly enriching to hear you. Raj Vedam ji, the scientific acumen that you display is really quite remarkable. And Nilesh ji, we all look up to you for your chronology studies going back into antiquity. Thank you, all of you. Thank you for this esteemed panel. Thank you to the viewers. And I'm sure that all the viewers are doing all the sharing, liking, subscribing, and pressing the bell icon. And also request you to spread this knowledge through your WhatsApp groups and through other means of social media as far as you can, so that it benefits the maximum number of people. Thank you so much. Good night from here. And to the 2 people in the US, a very good day. Namaste. Thank you. Thank you very much. Jai Hind. Vande Mataram.